Good morning. Since we're all sitting in our own houses, um, can I ask you all if you can stand as we read Romans chapter 13, 1 to 7? Those who can stand in your own houses, I request you to stand as I read this verse. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. But for he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom in whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. May Lord bless the reading for us. May you all be seated. Many times we are asked, what is the value of the doctrine of predestination? What is the value of the doctrine of sovereignty? People usually accuse us that even if the doctrine of Trinity is not there, even doctrine of sovereignty is not there, that's perfectly fine. You don't require that because the doctrine of sovereignty is not seen to have any practical value in our daily lives. So this might only be good enough for people to argue over, but it is really not helpful for what happens to me in the regular work in the world. Now, as we have studied this doctrine so many times, particularly from the book of Revelation, we know how wrong that is. Not only for me to grow as a Christian, to understand the gospel, to grow in the gospel, the doctrine of God's sovereignty is so important, but it's the greatest comfort a Christian has when he sees things around him. When most rules and regulations do not make any sense, the only thing that would make sense is God commands it and God is sovereign. And as we look at this very passage in front of us, I hope we learn that nothing stays away from this doctrine of God ordaining things. Not only God is in control of things, but God is the one who ordains things to come into its place. As we continue the practical discourse in the book of Romans, this great epistle has been described by so many people, and some call that as a complete systematic theology of sorts. Because almost every topic that a Christian would want to know about, from theoretical to practical, it is always there in this book. And today we come to the doctrine of the government and those who rule over us. Now, this portion that is in front of us looks pretty straightforward and simple. But as I'll show to you in some time, that this passage is not without its problems. One very common problem that you need to understand is that in the 7 verses, you do not find even once Christ mentioned. So some commentators have gone to the extent of saying this cannot be written by Paul at all. In fact, some people said this is not even a Christian doctrine. This looks more like the early Greek Stoicism, which told people to suffer whatever they can suffer. Now, when we look at this passage, many people would straight off get the meaning of this passage by what it is written, that you have to submit to the government. So you will find even non-reformed people who do not follow the sovereignty of God as a doctrine to understand the reasons or understand the reason why God has asked us to submit to a government. The problem becomes even diverse because the same passage is taken by reformed people and they will tell you that we have a right, a God-given right of freedom, a natural right of freedom that we can use, and we can use it to fight against the government. Now, as Paul is writing to you this passage about submission to the government, you need to remember this one important thing, that Paul is writing at a time when that government which is in front of him is not even remotely friendly to Christians. Pretty soon, Paul himself will be killed because of his faith. He has seen these Romans rule his land for almost 100 years now. Paul has seen their cruelty, Paul has seen their paganism. But even with all of these things that Paul has seen, Paul still tells you that you need to submit to this government. And it looks very odd that Paul was a Jew to begin with. And how can Paul, who was a Jew, will accept a pagan ruler and say you need to submit to this ruler? That's again a reason that many people would tell you that this is not the work of Paul. This would be a different writer. Now, the way you need to understand this is, it is very interesting where this chapter starts. In fact, many of them tell you that, those first 7 verses are not actually the part of the scriptures. In fact, the verse 8 is from where it should start. Because if you read the way it ends, chapter 12, at the end of chapter 12, verse 21, you read, be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And then verse 8 says, "Oh, no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." That's verse 8 of chapter 13. So people tell you that, maybe the verses 1 to 7 are not really written by Paul. Paul missed those section, and 21, and after verse 21 is directly verse 8. Because it almost looks like it's a continuation of thought, that how should a Christian love? How should a Christian repay? Now, even before we get into the details of this chapter, we need to understand why is this chapter so important for us to understand. Every chapter or every book, usually we study the principles involved, and then we study the practicality. We study the theory first, and then we study the practicality. And when we're looking into the government and a reaction to the government, we find it difficult because somehow we are coming directly to the practicality, and the theory seems to be missing. Now, it's important because you have got countries like American Christianity who have fought the British ancestry and even a civil war to give for themselves a somehow what they might call it as a Christian country. You can also argue, if you understand about the history of England and Scotland, the war of the Scottish Covenanters against the Crown of England for religious rights. So when things like this happen, it is very easy or almost appropriate for people to say, we are Christians and we have a right given by God to us to fight against the power which is evil. Isn't liberty and freedom a natural God-given right to all of us? So when we look at this passage is tremendously important for us. Why? Because a lot of questions on the government A lot of questions on how we see the government, a lot of questions on how we obey the government would be found here. You'll find questions, can we rebel against the government? We'll ask whether we really have a natural liberty, natural right of liberty and freedom. We can check what is the role of a government. Does the government have a right, or should the government be helping us when we are in times of need? Should the government be starting schools and colleges, generating work, helping people like that at a time like this when we're suffering a pandemic? Should the government be the ones who builds hospitals for you, builds roads for you? Again, we need to ask, which is the best form of government? Is self-rule the best type of rule? Or why not have no government at all? Because if we are ruling our own self, shouldn't we be able to control our own self? So wouldn't be a type of anarchy with no government better than actually having a government? How limited is the scope of this government? Which form of government is better? Is democracy better or communism better? Is fascism good or is Nazism better? We come to all these discussions possibly from this chapter, God willing. We'll see all of these questions in the days to come. But firstly, we need to go back to the first question I started. How does this chapter or how does this section fit into this book? Because we have said many commentators, even new ones, say this does not fit into the book. But you will understand, and if you read the chapter continuously, you'll understand that this fits perfectly into where the Holy Spirit inspired Paul to write it. In fact, isn't it interesting that this whole passage comes immediately after Paul speaks to you about how we treat our enemies? In fact, let's try this. Let's read from Romans chapter 12, verse 18 onwards, to Romans chapter 13, the two verses, and you'll see a link, right? We'll read from verse 19, Romans 12. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him a drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that are ordained of God. Whoever therefore resisted the power, resisted the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. You go down and you'll find God, verse 4, the government is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth well. You understand the link here. Paul is writing in a context where the immediate government in front of him is their enemy. He has just spoken to us how you should treat his enemy, and when they see the government as the enemy, there's a chance of thinking, okay, Paul is not talking about the government probably. He's talking about my personal enemies. And Paul doesn't want you to think like that. And so he takes it from there and moves it. These, your personal enemies are there at one side, and the government is also an enemy. And if you don't think you'll submit to the enemy, this is what you need to do. There's a second also crucial aspect in this. Paul has just told to us that you will not take revenge. You will not take vengeance. Vengeance belongs to God. But if vengeance belongs to God, all the wrongdoing that we have faced in this world, who will take vengeance for that? And so Paul says, when there is injustice, God, in his sovereignty, even on this earth, has kept a government who will and who can take vengeance if it's required. So you do not play a role of a vigilante. You don't go around bashing up people, seeing that rules are followed. No, because God has kept the government to do its job. Many times we would want to take up law in our hands when we see things are bad. But Paul wants to tell us that you cannot take vengeance. Vengeance will be taken by God. We cannot take revenge. In fact, last time, remember when we spoke about how a Christian's attitude should be, we showed how diametrically opposite the attitude is of the world. We live in an age where the human resource or the HR psychologists recommend voodoo dolls for employees. They tell employees to you make dolls for yourself shaped or that looks remotely like your boss. And then you can put pins and nails or punch your boss so that the anger can be taken out rather than struggling with your anger inside you. That anger inside you will create problems, but you can't scream at your boss. So might as well you put all your anger against the boss on that doll. You don't have to speak out. But the Christian does not take revenge, not even on the doll, because that shows the desire of his heart. Rather, the Christian is told again and again to bless, and not curse. But even in the midst of all this, when injustice is seen and I lose complete hope of things, God says there is a government which I have placed, and it will also has the right to take vengeance. Verse 4 is exactly that. For he is a minister of good to thee, God to thee for good. If thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So we see the chapter continues in the flow. It's a new section, all right, but the thought is continuous. It's still immensely practical. The enemy, the Roman state, should not only be prayed for, but Paul's listeners have to submit to them. Now, this is very different for a writer like Paul to mention this, because you remember, he's a Jew. In fact, we read in Romans chapter 9 itself that he's a zealous Jew. So much so that almost 3 chapters are dedicated to his Jewish brethren, chapters 9, 10, and 11. We realize that there's a good number of people inside the Roman church who are Jews. Now, what is the problem here? If you remember, the Jews would never accept anyone to be their king who's not been appointed by God. You remember Deuteronomy 17:15? You can turn with me on that. Deuteronomy 17:15, that says, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shall thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. So for the Jew, the Romans were never their government, would never be their king. As a family, we have been studying the book of John. Even in the Gospel of John, you'll find there is one brothers don't believe in him, and for brothers tell them, okay, if you are God and if you're claiming what you are, why didn't you go to Jerusalem and show yourself to everyone? The entire idea of the Jews was, if Jesus really is the Christ, you remember even John the Baptist asking that question, if Jesus really is the Christ, why can't he do what he has come for, establish the kingdom in Jerusalem? Because for them, they will not subject themselves to any other king except for someone who's from their own community. In fact, this was the reason, remember, they asked the strict question to the Lord, that whom should we pay taxes to? Is it lawful that we pay taxes to Caesar? If you understand, it is a very cunning question. It was a loaded question. It has the law and it has Caesar. So the answer cannot break the law, and the answer cannot break the current system of government which is there. And you need to understand, when the Lord is telling them about this, He's following exactly what the Old Testament is teaching. Beloved, not even for a single second, and I'll emphasize this in almost every session, that never think that the Old Testament teaches something which is diametrically opposite to the New Testament. The teaching of God in both the Testament would be essentially the same. When it comes to practical outworking, the basic theory behind it would always be the same. God requests us, God commands us to submit to the government which is there. Be it Joseph or be it Daniel, the command to submit does not change. This attitude of the Jews was extremely dangerous. I'll quote Calvin on this passage. He says this: there are indeed always some tumultuous spirit who believe that the kingdom of Christ cannot be sufficiently elevated unless all earthly powers be abolished, and that they cannot enjoy the liberty given by him except they shake off every yoke of human subjection. This error, however, possessed the minds of the Jews above all others, for it seemed to them disgraceful that the offspring of Abraham, whose kingdom flourished before the Redeemer's coming, shall now, after his appearance, continue in submission to another power. What is Calvin telling us? That even during Calvin's time, there was this group called as the Anabaptists. One of the most striking things about the Anabaptists was that they believed that since Christ has come and since they are members of Christ's kingdom, they no longer have to subject to any earthly government. That's the reason the Anabaptists would not even enroll themselves to the army, or they decide to go for a war. Along with them, Calvin says there are other people also, like the Jews, who would not bend their necks to the government which is there. Calvin continues, there was also another thing which alienated the Jews no less than the Gentiles from their rulers, because they all not only hated piety, but also persecuted religion with the most hostile feelings. Hence, it seemed unreasonable to acknowledge them for legitimate princes and rulers who were attempting to take away the kingdom from Christ, the only Lord of heaven and earth. What is Calvin saying? That even at that time, the Jews could see that the Romans are killing Christians. They're going against every teaching of the Bible. And how can someone tell you to go down, bend your neck towards this? And that's the reason it would always seem diametrically opposite of listening to the commands of a government when the government itself looks anti-Christian. That's the reason this passage has to be taken by us extremely seriously. Because this has a practical outworking, not only for the government, but also at the place where you are working. We will come to about that in some time. So we need to see how serious this passage is. There are so many things that we can take away from here. There are several passages in the scriptures. Like, for example, you can read that later. You have 1 Timothy 2, you have Titus 3. We have a similar passage on 1 Peter. We have Jeremiah, Daniel that we spoke about. All these passages exhort us to live as people who will submit to the authority which is kept on top of us. God tells us this is the attitude that we need to have against not only our enemies who persecute us, but against the government also that'll do the same. Why does Paul tell us this? Because Paul is firmly convinced that God is in control and that nobody secures a position of rulership unless God will permit that to happen. This government is not a human device. This is not something that people came together and planned. Every government everywhere has a divine origin to it. The servants of God must accordingly submit to its law. Paul regards these rulers not as autonomous. They are not someone who are autonomous, comes from two words, auto, self, and nomos, law. These are not people who are ruling by their own devices. They think they are, but they have been established by God, and that's what Paul is telling us. Every ruler is God's servant, and that's important for us to see. Every ruler is God's servant. This gives the ruler a special dignity, but at the same time, it stresses the position that we are subordinate to the ruler. Since he is a ruler, we do not do whatever we wish. Since he is under God, he cannot do whatever he wishes, but he does the will of God, and we do the will of God as God has told us. So God has told us that when we look at the government, what we should do. You need to understand this again and again, even before we go into the passage, that many people have told, okay, if Paul is teaching this thing that we need to be subject to a government, it's extremely stupid, it's extremely wrong, because this government is a tyrannical government. How can you tell someone to obey Rome when Rome tells you that you need to bow down in front of Caesar? We saw that in when we studied Revelation. Offer incense to Caesar. So how can Paul tell us to submit to a government like this? But I want you to understand this. Paul is not telling you what is the perfect government. Paul is not telling you, okay, if your government is perfect, if your government shows every sign that it is God's government, then you submit to it. The problem is not that this government is right, or the government is established by God, or the government is less tyrannical or more tyrannical. No. The problem is not even, have they taken over someone else's rule? Do they have their own authority? Do they have usurped authority? None of that matters. Paul knows that governments are bad. Though Paul had used his Roman citizenship to good use at times, but he knew very well that states can be unjust. His own Lord was crucified by an unjust state. He himself had suffered by the hands of men. Remember, he said, I was flogged. He very well knew authorities can be unjust. But because authorities are unjust, does not make the commandments that are given to us null and void. We do not do things, as we said earlier, based on other people's act towards us. We do things because God has commanded us to do things, regardless of what the person in front is doing. So in that sense, autonomous rule on this side of heaven, even in purely Christians ruling, with Christians having the law written in their hearts after conversion, every government on this earth, on this side of heaven, will be cruel, will be tyrannical, will be sinful, because it's man. Also, we need to understand a very important question. Paul does not suggest to you that let's have a government. Do you notice that? Paul does not suggest to us what could be better. Could we have self-rule? There are many Christians who tell us that no, in a perfect state, when we all do everything that we want, we are all good people, then maybe we will not need a government. If everyone knows how to take care of himself, we will not need a government. Now, brethren, even if you are a Christian today, even if you're living in a society full of Christians, even with you being converted and God's love being in your heart and you being commanded to love each other, that cannot happen that there is no rule over you. You need a government now. And guess what? You will have a government when you become perfect and you be in heaven. You will need a ruler now who's evil, but controlled by God. But when you'll be perfect in heaven, you'll physically see the greatest ruler, the mightiest ruler over you. You are never left on your own. The whole idea of human autonomy is not only foolish, not only unbiblical, it can never happen in any part of the world. There are very good anarchists who keep telling us the benefits of autonomous rule, how people in autonomy can be much more happy. But the evidence is always against autonomy, even if someone has to simply look at nature. Now, there's one more important fact that probably will come at the end of the section. That how much can a person understand by simply looking at nature about governments? But before that, let's come to the text at hand. Verses 1 to 7, those speaks about one element about a Christian's attitude towards the government. I've further divided this into three sections. Verses 1 to 2, 1 and 2, where we'll see the Christian reasons for a government and the Christian reason why someone has to submit to the government. Verses 3 to 5, we see the role of the government and the concept of a limited government. And verses 6 and 7, we'll see what we saw in verses 1 and 2. If you really believe what Paul tells you to do about the government, are you doing that practically in your life in verses 6 and 7? Though we may not get time to do all the sections today, but I would still want to start with verse 1. Let's turn to verse 1. Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that are ordained of God. Now, I come to an important word, in verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, or in some translation it is highest powers. Now, this does not mean that this particular word, highest power, is been used in the Bible in various places in the New Testament, usually referring to angelic beings. Like, for example, if you remember Ephesians 6:12, where you have the word principalities and powers, it's the same word which is used as the highest powers here. So most of the time in the Bible, in the New Testament, this verse implies angelic powers. So some people have also tried to show that maybe this can mean that every government established has an angelic power behind it. Not necessarily, but in the context of this looks very similar to, if you can just mark this out, Luke 7 verse 8, where you have the centurion who had a servant unwell, and he comes to the Lord and he says, I'm someone who's in authority. I've got people under me, I have power over them. So here, this passage is not talking about angelic powers, but people in authority, physical people in authority. There are many reasons for that. For example, you find later in that same passage, they're called as God's servants. It said that they use the sword. We are asked to pay taxes. None of that can be for angelic beings. We don't pay taxes to angelic beings. We don't even submit to angelic beings. The difficulties on the idea is great. So it's better to understand this, that every soul is supposed to be subject to the authorities over him or her. Now, there's something even better that Paul explains to us. He says, let every soul. There is no connecting um, participle there. It's a natural following what we read from verse from chapter 12. But what is interesting here is Paul is not simply speaking about Christians. Have you noticed that? He gives a rule for every soul. That the Hebraism is used, and we have seen in the Bible that when the word soul is used in certain contexts, it can be used for only the spirit of man separated from the body, or like here in this particular verse, it refers to a complete man, spirit and body, every person. So here's what Paul is saying. He says every person has to be subject unto the higher powers. He makes no distinction. This is a universal duty. Because if you don't do this, if you don't do this, you will be facing consequences of this. Be it a Christian or a non-Christian man, you have to keep yourself subject to the authority. This duty is incumbent on all people simply because they are people. Now, the point here also should be noted that it doesn't mean highest power. And I'll tell you why this is important. We have a tendency to think that someone who's immediately over me is not that important. Someone who's immediately over him and someone who's immediately over him, and in that hierarchy, I should listen to the one on the topmost level of the hierarchy. I don't need to fear someone who's immediately over me. That's not the point that Paul is making. Paul is saying you have to submit to the authority. Anyone who's top of you, you're not going to wait for the highest authority, because that's going to be disobedience. That's going to be non-submission. Now, again, we need to understand from that word, what does Paul ask us to say? He says, submit, subject to the higher powers. Now, let's understand this word, subject yourself. This has a connotation of the idea of obedience. But obedience itself is not a complete picture. In fact, obedience can give us a wrong picture. The word Paul uses is subject, which shows us there is something important. This is the same idea that we see in so many portions of scripture. For example, we read about that in Ephesians 5:21, which says, submit to one another. Now, there is an obedience involved in that, but the principal idea is not obedience. Principal idea is I understand that there's someone who's better, someone who's over me. We understand from the condition between husbands and wife that wives submit to their husbands. Now, the idea of obedience is there, but obedience is not the only idea. Submission is much more broader. When I submit myself to a fellow brother, when I submit myself to a pastor, I understand that I'm subordinate to this person who's Christ's representative, be it inside the church or be it inside the government. The pastor is God's servant, so is the prime minister. And I have to submit to both of them. It necessarily does not entail every aspect of obedience, because when you stretch the idea of obedience to a different level, then you'll end up thinking like the Anabaptists. They're asking you to obey and you have to obey. No, I need to submit. And that was a submission that you'll find many people who are called to die for their faith, who are called to go onto the stake to be burnt, they submitted to the rule of the state. They did not obey exactly what the state wanted them to do. But the state gave them a choice. Either you obey or you die. And they submitted to that idea that we will obey, or we will die rather than obey. And they kept saying, we rather obey God than man. And in the idea of rather obeying God than man, this does not cancel the idea of submission. So when it comes to the government, we understand that the government is higher than us, and we should never have the idea of taking revenge or plan vigilantism. And most people who have done it have not understood the idea of submission. We submit to the government knowing one thing, that every authority comes from God. That's what we learn from verse 1. Paul does something brilliant. I hope you notice that. He starts with the negative first, and then he gives the positive. Look at that. For there is no power but of God. There is no power but of God. So I don't want to look at the Romans. I don't want to obey them. How can I obey the Romans? Paul says, but there is no power but of God. If Romans have a power, you are not obeying Rome in this. You're obeying God. If any power has come, it is because God has now the positive, because that power is ordained of God. This is not simply that there is a government there and government has already been there. But maybe this government has not rightly been established. They are not rulers by right. I want you to understand order in that state or the state's existence, no matter how it has come, is irrelevant to me. Today, if I am in a country which is forcibly doing wicked practices like China, or a fascist country, or in history, we have countries like Nazism, German Nazism, we don't end up thinking that this power has not come by right. So should I submit to them? The Christian recognizes that his submission is to, firstly, God. That state, those authorities are there because of divine origin, because God has ordained it. God has decreed for it. Now, brothers, I want you to understand, this is not the divine right theory. This is not the king has got the divine right to rule from God. That's not the point here. We need to understand how Luther explained this to us. That every government, whichever government is there, is ordained by God. So I listen to it. This is not as much as someone standing up and saying, God has kept me in this position, so I will rule. No, he has forgotten who has kept him there. So a Christian recognizes the order in the state, even if the state exceeds its lawful function. Even if the state tells you to do something which is not Christian, you stand for the person who is supreme over the state. But even in all of that, you still submit to the state. Jesus told you, remember? Render to Caesar all the things that are Caesar's, and render to God all those things that belong to God. This is a legitimate deduction that state has a delegated authority. And we speak about this even more, that how do I respond to a state? Do I live in fear of the state? Even when we go ahead of this verse, there are very important questions that this chapter throws at us. In philosophy, this is called or you can consider political philosophy, and by no means it's an easy way to walk through. I consider Christianity to be the best system in the world because Christianity answers every major topic of philosophy that you can think of consistently, be it ethics, be it epistemology, how you get knowledge, be it metaphysics about the world and the truth which is out there, to right now what we're looking at, politics. How does a Christian get his view on politics? The Christian's view of a state, we can do that as a separate study, but I'll just touch the peripherals for you to understand. No matter who and which government is ruling on top of him, what type of government is ruling on top of him, a Christian realizes that any state which has to be there comes because of God. States exist because of God. This by far, let me again tell you, is not a very easy matter to solve. And I would love to have a discussion or a study about this, God willing, sometime. But I want you to whet your appetite a bit by understanding the kind of problems you'll face when you want to think about the government. For example, have you ever thought, how did the first government come into being? How did someone decide that you should be my ruler? For example, some people say it's very obvious. Someone took power, control over the weak. Now, if that is true, if someone took control over the weak, then tomorrow someone else can remove him, next day someone else can remove him, and this will only become a cycle. The idea of why that person has to rule is not there. Or some people would tell you, no, people came together. And when people came together, they decided, okay, we'll have this person become our king. Now, the problem does not get solved even then. When people came together, how did they decide that one person will rule over them? Now, I know what you're thinking. You might say, why is that a problem, brother? They might have agreed that we'll take a majority vote, and in the majority, whoever wins will become. But here's the problem. How did they come to the conclusion that the majority vote is right? How did they come to a conclusion that the majority vote should be allowed? Now, surely they cannot take a majority vote to decide if majority vote should be allowed to win. Because it is stupid. The argument does not stop anywhere. You cannot form a government by observing things in nature. That's the major drawback of every worldly philosophy. People who have tried to look at nature and find out that they need a government would always land up in authoritarian government, that government is existing only to chain up people. There would be governments that are built on other ideas, that the learned should rule the less learned, or the government should be existing for the best wishes for the working class. Then we have other questions. Which is a better government? Is a welfare state better, where the state does everything for you, including medicines, healthcare, provisions, unemployment funds, like we discussed earlier, building of roads? Or is the government better, which is pure capitalism? How much does the government have control over your life? Now, we have already said this. Every form of government always would be evil. Be it Nero, when Paul is writing, be it communist China today, or be it the democratic countries, governments in which we are staying. Beloved, you cannot see nature and come to a conclusion that democracy is a better form of government. You cannot, because democracy is a worse form of government than anything else. So if you're completely confused by I'm supposed to stand in front of God, supposed to stand in front of the government, obey what the Bible tells me. Where is my greatest comfort? And that's how we started today. The sovereignty of God. That every government is ordained, decreed, put into place by God. There is no power but of God. The powers that be around you are ordained by God. This is one of the greatest happiness for a Christian at times when he gets persecuted in the hands of the government itself. It is a joy when that afflictions would happen to know that my God is the one who's behind all of this and who at a snap of his finger can end it. When you see history of the world and histories of various states, sometimes it's purely shocking how kingdoms which have come up in years and years and years, sometimes the end is so quick and rapid. Sometimes we think certain governments and states can never end. And that's what Rome thought about itself, that it would always be there. And Rome ended in such a manner, never to be found again, at least in that same political scenario which was there. Beloved, for a Christian, the greatest thing that he can have is understand that when he stands in front of a government which is going to kill him for his faith, that government is a God ordained government. Your joy in this life comes because of God, because of God's ordination in the worst of times. In the worst of times. As a Christian, if God has given you the joy in your heart today, when you see this, it's because of the Son's work. And that Son's work has made you a brother of his Son. And you are part of God's family. And because you're part of God's family, he's telling you to do exactly what you're supposed to do, no matter where the government comes from and which direction the government seems to be headed. Paul tells you even later, you can't fear this government. You wouldn't fear this government because at the back of your mind, you know who is behind this government. Are you worried about what is happening in the country today? Possibly you're looking at the government and not looking at the God who's behind it. Are you thinking that Christians will be persecuted? Of course, yes, they are being persecuted. But think about the God who's behind all of that. If today morning, if you're not a Christian, all of that which I'm telling you will not make any sense. Because unless you are a Christian, unless you have that peace of God in you, you cannot see God in every aspect of this life. If you do not believe in the Son of God who died for his church on the cross, all of this would make no sense to you. You'll only live in fear and anger and anguish and always every attempt to rebel against the government. But a Christian does not. Even if the government tells him to walk into fire because he has obeyed the Lord than them, he will submit joyfully, knowing that behind the government And the reason the government exists and the time till that government will exist is because his God, the God that he will see face to face when the fires will burn him, that God has put this government in its place. That's our greatest joy in the midst of the worst governments. Let's look to God in prayer. Abba Father, as we come to your throne to study what people struggle with at times, not knowing which direction to turn to. So much of ink would have been spilled in people to think which is the right form of government. So much of blood would have been spilled for people to prove that they are the right government. So many wars would be fought for people to simply stay in power or for others to rebel and remove them. But Master, as we look at your words, we understand the purpose of it all. That you are in complete command of all of this. You have ordained them for this purpose, and they are your servants. Help, Master, that we have the right attitude, that even when we suffer at the hands of unlawful, tyrannical governments, the joy inside us would be it's a God's ordination, it's a God's decree. And this will pass away. And after this, I'll see my Lord who has counted me to suffer through this. Master, we pray that each one of us here would get your mind, your son's mind, to understand things, to submit to things, and to understand that the way of the world is always wicked. The governments of the world are always wicked. And help us, Lord, that when we see all these crumbling governments around us, we look up to see your son's kingdom and your son coming down to finally join us together in his glory. In that great King's name, we offer this prayer. Amen.